welcome to the first episode of GameCube Prison, a retrospective series on the poor but excellent games still trapped on Nintendo's cute purple box. We'll have a look at what made the GameCube such a cool console, and look at games like Star Wars Rogue Leader, which has some DNA shared with an upcoming game, Star Wars Battlefront. I'm Ludwig Kitzman for Games Radar Plus, and I'm joined by Anthony John Agnello.
Yeah, when the GameCube came out, November of 2001, it was sort of both the darkest of times for Star Wars and the brightest of times, because there were new movies, there were new games coming out, but all of the best games in the Star Wars universe were sort of locked to the PC. There were a lot of really good sims, spaceflight sims like X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter, and really good first-person games like the Jedi Knight series, but there weren't things that were really, really fast and arcadey and fun, much like the game that Factor 5 was making for the Nintendo 64, and then a launch title on the GameCube with the Star Wars Rogue Squadron series. And then Rogue Leader was one of the very first GameCube games to come out, and it is spectacular.
Well, no, why do you say it's spectacular? Like, I know it took full advantage of the GameCube's capabilities. It was quite a technological showcase.
Well, that's the funny thing. You look at most launch games for a console, and
they look like garbage.
And they're half-baked. They're never fully sure of what this machine can do. Whereas Factor 5 came off of Rogue Squadron on the N64, and then we're like, we know exactly what Star Wars game we want to make, and they took advantage of every little thing the GameCube could do really, really well.
Tell me about progressive scan, Anthony. Tell me about all of that progressive scan.
All the pro scan. You just fire it up, and it's like, do you want 480i or 480p?
Interlaced. Ew.
And so it looked like, you can't really stress how great a 480p game looked at that time. And it wasn't just, the resolution. There were all these things happening on screen that you'd never really seen before. We'd flown an X-Wing through the trenches in the Death Star, we'd been down to Hoth and brought down AT-ATs before, but you never saw these sort of showers of particles in an explosion when you brought down a Death Star tower. You never heard John Williams' music so perfectly represented in a console game. And you got all of this stuff in Rogue Leader, and, it was mind-blowing. It was so cool to look at, to listen to. It really felt like you were inside of Star Wars. But it wasn't just, the audiovisual presentation. It was even the GameCube controller felt perfect for this game.
I think when you played this the first time, if you were a Star Wars fan, the feeling that you got at that point is very similar to the feeling we get now when we see Star Wars Battlefront. Right?
Yes.
Like, it's just this authentic recreation of some of your favorite moments from the movie. But this game also had original scenes.
Yeah, and so it opens, you feel like you get a tour through the original trilogy of films with, start with that Death Star run from A New Hope, and it closes with trying to fly the Millennium Falcon out of the second Death Star as it explodes. But sandwiched between all of the big moments from New Hope, Empire, and Jedi are all of these really cool levels that pull from, the Star Wars novels. There is a stage where you have to go into this secret Empire facility in a place called the Maw. And there's another one that's just wholly original where you see, 15 years before Star Wars Episode 7, the J.J. Abrams thing, we see a crashed Star Destroyer in Rogue Leader. It's on a beach, and you have to escort a Rebel transport ship as you assault this crashed Star Destroyer. And it's just so cool, the stuff that it lets you do. You don't really get to see much of Cloud City from the outside in Empire Strikes Back. And then in Rogue Leader, you get an entire level on Cloud City, and it's really, really hard because you need to use an A-Wing, and it's not easy. That's another thing that characterizes Rogue Leader. It is a very, very difficult game. You can get through the early stages, but to get the medals, there are gold, silver, and bronze medals for each stage. To get the medals, you have to play really, really well.
But of course, it helps that the game runs so well. It runs at just under 60 frames per second, and this is going back to what we were saying. This is a great technological showcase for the GameCube and what made it such an interesting console. But beyond that, why do you think this mix of Star Wars and sort of arcade-style gameplay was emblematic of the GameCube?
Because it was emblematic of all the things that GameCube did really, really well. It would take a very complex sort of game idea, the sort of thing that had been flourishing on PC throughout the late 90s, and made it very, very quick and accessible, and something you could just pick up and play in 2 seconds. X-Wing versus TIE Fighter is not the easiest game to sort of get your head around, but it's very, very rewarding once you do. At the exact same time, if you go back and play Star Wars Arcade from the early 80s, as cool as that was at the time, it's incredibly simplistic now. Too simplistic. And Rogue Leader sort of married those two approaches. You could just hop in and play a level, but to master it was really, really difficult, and that speaks to what the GameCube did best. Really, really complicated, beautifully structured ideas in a very simple and approachable package.
Now, if we were to free this game from GameCube Prison, and this is the goal of the show, is we're trying to imagine what would happen if we could somehow get these games out of their exclusivity bubble. What do you think a game like Battlefront could learn from Rogue Leader?
Make Star Wars ships feel different from one another. My favorite thing about Rogue Leader's presentation of all the different ships, whether it's the A-Wing, the B-Wing, the X-Wing, the Y-Wing, the Millennium Falcon, everything feels very different. And something that the original Battlefront games got wrong is that everything sort of felt the same. Spaceflight wasn't really a showcase. And Rogue Leader really nailed that distinctive feel of all the Star Wars ships.
I don't remember it ending that way, but do join us again next week for another episode of GameCube Prison, in which we'll be looking at a little Capcom game called PN03.